So as usual, there's more that I don't understand than I do. Just to kick things off, and usually people in this group, there's enough people who are willing to talk that I don't really have to do much to get things started. But just toward the beginning, I still don't understand what he means by concept. Clearly that is a key word for him, and it doesn't, like a lot of stuff in Hegel, it doesn't mean, he's not using it in sort of a conventional sense, at least not a conventional contemporary sense. And he talks about things are the concept and things aren't the concept, and so I don't really understand what that means. And so that's one big thing. And this phrase that he keeps using of things returning into themselves, I don't really know what that means. And I don't really understand force, which means I don't understand a big chunk of this reading. And then one thing in particular, because I'm still not sure what he's doing with consciousness here. Maybe Eric and Hunter can clue us in, but he makes this distinction between consciousness and us. And, so for example, on page 80, next to the little 83, he says, first of all, we therefore have to step into its place and to be the concept that works out for what is contained in the result. And so before that, he's referring to, like at the beginning of section 133, the understanding has thereby sublated its own truth and the untruth of the object, and what to it as a result has come to be is the concept of the true as the true existing in itself, which is not yet the concept. So there's the concept again, which lacks the being for itself of consciousness. And then at the bottom of that section, in this, he says, we therefore have to step into this place. And so he's mentioning we in distinction from consciousness. And at the bottom of page 84, he does the same thing again. He makes this distinction between us and consciousness. And so, and then the I,
on that a bit.
What's that?
I feel like I can speak on that.
Okay, so help us out there.
At least in the secondary source I'm reading, he makes it sound pretty simple in that us is supposed to be like kind of like we the reader, or we the person who's like already achieved the philosophic attitude. So it's like the position that Hegel like maybe feels himself already to be at, or the position that like we're going to. So like my secondary author phrases it as like, this is the phenomenological observer, like the onlooker, as opposed to like consciousness, which is the current stage that Hegel's talking about, that's like victim to all its problems. But like I imagine like Hegel, the person who's like presenting this to us, is like the onlooker who's like looking back on this like it's the past. And so when he says like we need to step into this, he says like for us to like actually experience what understanding's going through, and for like the new object to arise, we have to like be in the shoes of consciousness or of the understanding, as a way of like letting this experience like be personal for us.
Just to keep that rolling, because I think it's good. Yeah, I think I agree with like the use of us and we, and like that, because like especially at that part that you mentioned, Nevitt, on section 83, page 80 and 81, he's talking about perceiving. Like he's talking about just he's doing like a rehash of some recent notes that he had made on perception and on what perception had done, and how it had come to accept an unconditional universal. The section that you were talking about was him kind of working through an argument that perception accepted an unconditional universal. He's going to explore that more. But like for us to be reading a book full of symbols, and then to be like interpreting it as having like a differential symbolic meaning within like a symbolic order, like a language, to speak a language and to be reading a book that has this text in it, we're past just perceiving. We're not like a pure perceiving consciousness. But these are just like, and so it's like Joey said, it's like, I don't know if we're at absolute knowing or anything like that. I don't know how he's gonna, I don't know if there's gonna be some point in the book where he's gonna be like, now some of y'all might not be here yet. You know, I don't worry. I'm here to like a bodhisattva. I'm here to bring you into absolute knowing. Don't worry. I don't know if he's going to do that, or if there's some part in the book that we are like stuck at or something. But I agree. At least for this right now, it's like it's like parts of a development that brought us to where we are now to engage with material like this, or to have concepts of things like this. And actually, that brings me to another point. It's like Joey said, looking back into the past, these things present themselves, or they appear. A good way to talk about it, given the content, is they appear like a concept or a series of concepts. And I think that when you say, or when Hegel says concept, to me, it's just always kind of, it's been this, I think in a way he is kind of using it in the traditional sense. But in but he's like using it in that traditional sense to kind of prove a point about how it's used in that traditional sense. He's trying to show, like, I think a lot of his is like, he's like, okay, I'm going to use this word, and I'm going to technically be using it in a way that a lot of people use it. But if you're going to talk like that, you're going to have to follow some pretty complex rules that I think a lot of people haven't talked about enough. Like, if we're going to say concept in the way that we're saying it, we're going to have to unravel some details about this to really pinpoint what's going on, you know, because it'll reveal something else about what's going on that we might not notice all the time, or that is the reason why I'm writing this book. But concept, yeah, it's just like this. It's there actually is probably like somewhere in my notes, like a formal definition of like what concept might mean for Hegel. But to me, it's just always been like the frozen, like boxed in form, the concept, the notion of the thing, it's like a version of the thing that is not the entirety of the thing in itself. It's this thing for me. It's this reflected version, or this thing that being in itself doesn't really mean a whole lot anymore, because he talked about how determinations of the in itself are only determinate for another. So it's kind of hard to talk about it at this point. But like, the concept is part of my understanding. The concept is a part of the understanding and its capacity to conceptualize, to use force to differentiate and conceptualize. I think that the understanding, in a way, uses force, or it interprets force to differentiate and to conceptualize. And that means to kind of freeze in place and look at and like separate and divide and categorize and tabulate. And now this is a response in the chat. Are you saying Hegel's saying concept should not be used casually? Yeah, I mean, I think he's, because what I do think, and this is just from my reading of this text, this does not come from like anything else, like, but like, it seems like there are words that he's using that are like more general, a little bit more casual, like things and terms. He says terms a lot, I've noticed. But there's certain stuff that I think he's more like, that's just like the thing itself or whatever. But yeah, for concept, I think it's like that, but I don't know.
Oh, to jump in and just maybe see if anyone else has seen this. Just what I basically just said in the chat, but my secondary text has been saying that like we should keep an eye out for how Hegel uses concept, because sometimes he's using it like in his sense, which to me is kind of, yes, like still vague. But then sometimes he'll use it like in the sense of like that particular shape of consciousness, where it's like, you know, the understanding has this concept of force, which I feel like is closer to our everyday idea of what like concept, how we use concept.
Do you want to hazard a explanation of what it means in that more specialized sense, the concept or notion?
Just to make a guess, I think if I get your point, Joey, and this actually, if you want to say that, like, no, I'm kind of missed the plot or something, please. But like, are you saying that it's like the concept insofar as it is the concept for the shape of consciousness that we are investigating at that moment? Like that, like, as far as perception or the understanding is concerned, this is the concept. Right. But then there's this other side. Okay, well, great. Joey responded to the chat and said yes, which is awesome. But I wanted to just keep talking about this this thing with the understanding, because we're finally getting into the understanding, and it's really interesting to me. This was a part that I've been really excited about. But I wanted to talk, because Nevitt, you talked about force, and I wanted to bring up two parts. There's a part near the end when he's talking about estrangement. He talks a lot about estrangement. But there's a part after that estrangement where he makes a point that understanding posits differences in unity. So if the understanding, just the understanding, and that includes like its, whatever, all of its faculties and mechanisms, the understanding posits a unity, right? And it's in that part of where he talks about soliciting and being solicited. It solicits by positing a unity. And that unity, the understanding, once it kind of chews on it, softens it up with its kind of universal medium. It's a universal medium, which is force. It posits differences in unity. And the understanding has determination as its object in that sense. Like, the understanding is the object of the understanding is determination, and determination is differentiation and self-sufficient properties of things. Things have determinations and properties, and the understanding slices apart and differentiates and has determination as its object. And that's why he says that explanation, when I'm explaining the facts about a thing, it's very satisfying, because it's like consciousness in conversation with itself, where I am positing and then recognizing the thing. It's kind of like what Nietzsche says, where he's like, it's kind of like this. It's just kind of like this, but it's like when Nietzsche says, if I decide what a camel is, and then I go outside and I point to a beast and I say, that's a camel. And then everybody around me is like, I guess, like, yeah, that's true in a certain sense. But in that same way, explanation is like an exploration of the determinations that are already the object of the understanding, or the posited objects of the understanding amongst a unity. But now, Nev, you said, does object and object of the understanding mean objective goal or thing to be understood? Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's
I mean, those are. It seems like there's, and maybe they're the same, but it seems like when you say object of the understanding,
yeah,
I'm not sure whether you mean like objective, like a goal that is trying to reach, like, someone say the object of this activity is something, or you mean object as in like the thing which the understanding is trying to grasp. You know what I'm saying? Like, or maybe those are the same, but in what sense are you using the word object?
Well, I think Hegel said it, and I think he said it kind of vaguely, and I don't really, I mean, like, he said it has, understanding has determination as its object, and like, in that sense, like Hegel, I mean, not only is he very well known for writing with a double meaning, but like, there could be something there that's pointing to that. But my personal reading was that it is like it's the thing that the understanding positions itself relative to its object, like whatever the first term, whatever it is posited or posits itself as relative to, that's its object. Especially with something like the understanding or perception or whatever, some I don't even know what I would, because you made this point, you asked the question in the Discord, like, what is consciousness for Hegel? And like, that's a tough cookie to crack, man. Like, I think of it, it's like this capacity, it's this unfolding, reflective being. But whatever that, as if there's like a reflective, if there's this reflective soliciting force, I guess we could call it, if there's a reflective soliciting force, it has an object. I think that's how, maybe that's that's grasping at how Hegel would try and say, like, a subject has an object, I think. But I don't know.
That's what I was asking. Is that what he means? So thank you.
I know that I'm going backwards. No, I'm not. I know when Hegel was writing, and I know, some 20th century philosophers, but for some reason, when it came to object of understanding, the phrase never brought up from Hegel, I instantly thought of Husserl, because my understanding of his phenomenology, he was talking about the object of the perception of what it is the consciousness is about. And I know I'm jumping to 20th century, but did anybody ever make a connection between Husserl and Hegel?
Actually, Nevitt did recently.
Oh, okay.
I'll tell. I mean, this is, so somebody should probably. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong about this. I mean, so my general sense is that 20th and contemporary phenomenology is related to Hegelian phenomenology, but they're not the same thing. But I think what they have in common, near as I can tell, phenomena is a Greek word which means appearances, and so what I think what people have been working on since at least Descartes has been what's the relationship between the mind and the world. And Descartes sharpens this distinction, makes it very sharp to where you've got the mind in here and the world out there. The two are utterly distinct. And so a big part of what philosophy is trying to do is answer the question, how do things out there in the world get into my mind? And secondly, how do I know that the representations in my mind are like the things in the world? And I think I'm thinking, Hunter or Chase, correct me, or Eric, but what Hegel and contemporary phenomenologists have in common is they want to undercut that distinction, or they want to circumvent that distinction and look at the appearances themselves. So rather than trying to say there's this sharp distinction between what's in the mind and outside the mind, look at what appears to us and let's study the actual phenomena that appears. And then I think that's where what they have in common, I think. But then they attack that problem, and here's where I just don't know enough to say much, but I think they attack that problem in similar ways. But I don't think, so I think there's similarities in the approach that Husserl takes and that Hegel takes, but they're not the same thing. Husserl ends up positing that there's a transcendental ego like Kant, which I'm guessing Hegel would say, no. Hegel's got this dialectical method, and Husserl has intentionality, where consciousness and the world are kind of in a dialectical relationship, but it's not the same thing. And so I think that they're related in the sense that they're both careful, intensive studies of phenomena and try to explain what being means from within the appearances themselves. Because, after Descartes and Hume and Kant, if you said, what is being in itself apart from human consciousness, you just can't answer that question anymore, because all you have is human consciousness. So you can't possibly get at the being of the thing independently of human consciousness, because all you've got is the phenomena of consciousness. And that forces Kant into a position where he says, well, the thing as it is in itself, we have absolutely zero access to. You can't really say anything about that. And then you have German idealists after Kant trying to fix that problem. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, Hunter, but I think one of the things that Hegel's trying to do is say to Kant, you're correct, and that the understanding is limited, and the understanding can't grasp the thing in itself. You're right about that. But reason can, because Kant said reason cannot, nothing can get you to the thing in itself, nothing. Whereas the sense I get from especially this section in Hegel is saying, because of this dialectical relationship, or this dialectical process that in a sense is reality, it provides reason a way of interrogating the things in themselves. And so that in a sense, then he overcomes the limitation that Kant has placed, that kind of falls out from Descartes and Hume and Kant. I don't really understand how that works, though. I mean, and maybe it's going to take more of the phenomenology, maybe I still won't understand it. But what I don't understand is how the dialectic, in some sense, gives reason access to the inner being of things, which seems to be what he's suggesting, if I'm not wrong. But I don't see how it works.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Chase.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think Hegel's phenomenology is pretty similar to Husserl. There's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. It seems like, okay, so Husserl is much more of a Kantian, and he's more of a transcendental idealist than a absolute idealist, so he's working within Kant's kind of frame of things more so, in that, he's trying to find the essential structures of the mind that make experience possible, or whatever these essential structures of experience are that account for just the phenomena, the appearances themselves. So it's more descriptive, where Hegel is, it seems to me like what he's doing is, okay, he's going with the phenomena, but the phenomena here is consciousness as it posits some kind of certainty of truth. So basically starting with the whole sense certainty thing, where, the abstract this that's supposed to be a particular, that's the kind of first motion towards, okay, this is true. So Hegel is saying, okay, let's just go with the movement of this as the phenomena and see where it leads. So it's definitely a lot different in that sense. But the other thing is, so the reason thing, I think we still need to basically read more Hegel to really get that. But it seems like what Hegel did with Kant about reason was that, so Kant said that reason always tries to go too far. It tries to reach towards the absolute and whatnot. But then by doing that, it leads to contradictions. So Hegel says that's great. That's basically means from those contradictions, you get more ways to posit truth or work within reason's inner dynamics of thought and whatnot. So those contradictions aren't just, Kant says, oh, we have a contradiction, crap, we're done, everyone go home, phenomena, noumenal, we can't do anything. Everyone go to sleep, night time. But but Hegel says, okay, no, that's actually the movement that reason, that consciousness, spirit, what all these terms, that's what it works through, is those contradictions. So that's going to be, he's using something kind of, he's taking Kant as the base of this, it seems like, but he's using it not as this stopping point, but as the launching off point almost. So that's what it seems like to me. But so Husserl he's more of a transcendental idealist in the sense that he does see that the mind is involved in experience in a kind of way that transcends it, and by transcend, that means basically that these structures of the mind are necessary in order to account for phenomena. It's basically it's pretty similar to what Kant is doing, except he's kind of almost doing it in a more detailed, more embodied kind of way, where he's more specifically talking about perception and kind of lived experience, where Kant was all about, they're both trying to find universal essential structures of consciousness, but in quite different ways. And Hegel, I think, is doing something similar, but he'll take something like, someone says that this is some kind of a universal structure of the mind or of something. He'll take that and then see where it leads by kind of showing, okay, if I follow this through, if I accept this as, certain truth, what does that entail? Is there anything that actually, by believing in this, it entails something that goes against it or leads to something else? So he's working within the movement of those things that I think Kant and Husserl were just simply trying to understand in a more Kantian, almost Platonic way, where there's simply this kind of, well, basically, like he talks about in the understanding of the kind of the inverted world, but more so just kind of this idea of the beyond that is thought, and it's our way of trying to categorize and understand the world that we posit as some kind of beyond that is the essence of appearances, but really it's our own mind trying to understand those appearances, that we don't understand that it's our own consciousness at this point, at least. So that's my take on that.
Just to keep that ball rolling, and to just say kind of, I guess, what I'm thinking. The question of what's the difference between reason and understanding, I think I've had two different understandings of that. Understandings of that, all right, that have come my way through just reading both Hegel and about him, and that's that I've heard that I've come to, the idea that for the understanding, there's this power of investigation and abstraction and differentiation and cutting apart and conceptualizing, right? And this interaction with force, and this understanding of the interplay of forces, and this attempt at reaching behind the veil of appearances and seeing hidden essences and things like that. But this understanding, I think, for Hegel, the one of the limitations of the understanding, there are two big limitations to the understanding that I guess I got, that I've picked up, and it's that, for one, understanding approaches objects of understanding, terms, concepts, whatever, and it sees a beyond, of itself present in its attempts at digging into the thing, and its attempts at digging into the in itself of the thing, or the thing itself, a thing in itself. It sees this beyond of its capacity. It sees there as being a beyond of its capacity. And it's the realm beyond thought, it's the edge of thought or whatever. But for Hegel, I think the reason does not see a beyond. Reason, and it sounds a little bit like, yes, like we're directly getting at the thing in itself or whatever. Like reason is just fundamentally bypassing the limitation of the phenomenal consciousness, and you just didn't know it yet. We really are getting at the things in themselves. It sounds like that, but I think that the other thing that I think makes it a little bit more sensible is that I think understanding is sort of like an act, like understanding something is like this tearing apart. And its problem, I think, for Hegel's problem with the understanding is that it doesn't go far enough in that it sees itself as being external to the object that it is investigating. The understanding fundamentally sees itself as being external to the thing that it's investigating and that it's trying to understand, trying to tear apart and differentiate and determine. And this being external to the object gives it this beyond quality, this beyondness, this total kind of escape from my experience. And reason, I think, and we haven't gotten to reason, like Chase is saying, we just haven't gotten to reason, but from my secondhand accounts of reason that I've come across, it's the general line has been that reason is seeing the immanent abstraction and negativity in things themselves, seeing the immanent kind of conceptual force in the thing itself, the force of being conceptualized or being conceptualizable. I guess, but this understanding, I think, stays as this. I forget. I think it's in like I don't know where, but he describes human beings as the night of the world. I forget where, but he describes human beings as the night of the world, and it's a really famous passage by him. Is him saying that human beings are like the night of the world, and when you look into the eye of a person, you can see it, and he says you see the night of the world, and you see a bleeding head here and a screaming visage, and like he describes this like trying to be like kind of spooky like scene of like horror. I like to get into this. I get this idea across that like there's this horrific entity of the understanding, this differentiating and this determining. And when we see it in its full glory, I guess, God, yeah. By the way, yeah, I'm being upset by some footage that I'm being shown right now, but I'm trying to push through it. It appears as like this disintegration of order, this horrible, nightmarish thing, the understanding. And I think that this is kind of where I think Hegel comes from with his approach in general. I guess this is like I've been trying to think like Travis, really feeling oriented rather than concept oriented. That's a joke. But I guess just what that means to me, all those terms, I guess, it kind of points to why Hegel does what he does, like why he's trying so hard to be so careful and so meticulous and so detail oriented and so persnickety with every little thing. And if you like, reread a couple paragraphs like in a row, like you'll see that he's saying the same thing in a couple different ways over the course of like 3 or 4 paragraphs. He's like and you'll be like, oh my God, that lesson at the end that I just finally picked up, he was saying that way back here. Oh my God. He was like trying to tell me this and I just wasn't listening. or something. I don't know. I must have had my brain turned off. But like he's, I think, trying to go through this because I think a part of his argument is that like when we see concepts, we think of concepts just as these gray, flat, determined things, these boring abstractions from the lush, green, I don't know, beautiful life that is the spirit of something or the thing in itself. And we're just abstracting and creating these weird, concrete, like idols of what's supposed to be there, rather than what was really there. It's this soft, nougaty center. But I think that, like, and I think he's looking at it like people seem to believe that life is rich and abstractions are gray. And abstractions include concepts. I think abstractions are like, but I think that his, like, a big point that, like, I guess, and I've just been thinking about this. I don't even know if this is totally valid, but I think that, like, a big thing that he's trying to get across in a lot of this is that abstraction is inherent to reality itself. And so it's not that life is lush and like theory is gray, but that like life already has this abstraction and this grayness. And if we live without analysis and theory, the non-examined life or whatever, it's like we will see that grayness. We will always be like unpleasantly reminded of that gray that's present. We will be confronted again and again and again with the gray and the abstract and the difficult and the contradictory, you know. But thank you, Ed, actually. Thank you for pulling up that quote. That actually contextualizes like a lot of what I'm saying. Thank you. But like I think his point is that life without theory is what's gray, but analysis makes it rich and identifies the multitude of colors and the values in that gray, you know. But I guess that, and I think that's the job of the understanding, and it's part of what the understanding is doing. But it gets caught. It gets caught, and it gets frustrated, and it can't dig its way out. And then it tries to look behind the curtain of appearances, looking for an inner essence of something, trying to find the color, and it finds nothing. It finds like a void. It finds just, and he says it in here, there would be nothing there if we didn't look back there. And I think that could be read in like a pure idealist, like Berkeleyan way. Like there is, if a tree falls in the woods, do you hear it or whatever? Whatever. Does it make a sound? Like that sort of idealism. But I think that the point, I guess, to me, the way I read it is that the understanding looks behind the curtain and finds nothing except what it puts there, and finds otherwise nothing. And that nothing is the void, that there's no substantive content or substantial self-sufficient essence behind appearance. But that nothing is what we find. And that nothing is a positive nothing in a way. It's the nothing of subjectivity. It's the nothing of my purposiveness or something, you know what I mean? It's like the investigating, the subjectivity, the void. In fact, actually, no, not the purposiveness. It's the absolute negativity that he calls subject. He's called subject absolutely negative before. And I think that's like a real, like that's kind of getting at what I'm saying, I guess. But I don't know if that even makes sense. But, yeah.
This makes me want to draw some connections with Nietzsche that may be fallacious and misleading. So please say so if this is true. So on my reading of Nietzsche, he would say something like the I don't know what to call it, the base of, and you know, any word we use is not going to be correct, because any word we use is already going to describe the world that we understand, but that the world, maybe as it is in itself, is flux. And you know, Hegel uses that word in this reading, or at least in this translation. And so in my reading, you know, for Nietzsche would say the world is a world of flux, but that because the rational mind can't make sense of flux, what the rational mind does is carve the world up into things. Because, you know, Nietzsche says things like, there are no things, really. There's just no things, because there's just flux. But that the rational mind can't understand pure flux. And so the rational mind carves its world up into different kinds of things that it can categorize and make sense of. And but when it does that, it's, I mean, he will say things like, which reminds me of this negativity thing with Hegel. He would say, Nietzsche will say things like, reason falsifies the world, which sounds crazy because, you know, reason is this thing that discovers truth. But I think the idea is, again, that reason, the only reality we have that we can really access is the reality that reason makes sense of. But then he says that, you know, that is, in a sense, that is the world of appearances, because the world, quote, beyond appearances is this unintelligible flux. And so anyway, that's what your discussion reminds me of. I mean, you know, it seems like Nietzsche doesn't go into a lot of detail about that. You know, he just makes comments here and there because that's not really where his interests lie. But it's almost as though Hegel is taking a similar idea and then trying to, you know, massage the hell out of it until he gets a really rigorous explanation of what that actually means. Whereas Nietzsche just kind of makes a few comments here and there and goes on to something else. But is there a similarity there?
I think so, definitely. At least with the understanding, it seems like there definitely is, in the sense that the understanding, you know, it breaks up experience into these categories, into you know, determinate forces, things like that. It's mainly a kind of grid that it sort of superimposes in order to understand things, but it does it in a way it's kind of it's almost like a filter that you can kind of stabilize things with. And so he talks a lot about the kind of dynamics of that, about you know, how we'll see, you know, there's always this kind of movement between, usually at least in the understanding force section, it talks a lot about, you know, there'll be this beyond or an inner or something like that, and at times that will be considered, you know, this pure flux. But then we'll have laws, like laws of physics or whatnot, that will try to stabilize those. So I think, you know, this is true of pretty much you know, since certainty of perception, we're trying to stabilize things into things and properties, you know, and the same thing is going on with law and explanation and all these things, in that the understanding is trying to get a grip on something that is much more slippery than its conception can really get at. And but then that kind of gap between those is what really drives this whole, you know, dialectic progression towards absolute knowing. But yeah, it definitely seems like there's a similarity there in that. So it's still, the thing is that Hegel hasn't really said exactly, you know, what he thinks the world is, you know, in itself or something like that, because those notions are really notions, don't really apply exactly in that context. It seems like basically what he's saying is that, you know, there's self-consciousness, there's consciousness or spirit as self-consciousness, that is always this kind of dichotomy that's also a relation between a subject and an object. And there's all these different combinations of those and this interplay between that. But the way it, what is real basically is that there will be these kind of gaps in these fissures in the subject's mode of grasping the object. So by the fact that it does come up with the, you know, this kind of stupid, you know, grid understanding kind of thing, these laws, and says like, this is absolutely certain. The fact that it does that and, you know, fails, that's actually what is part of, you know, this movement of self-consciousness, which I think that is what is, you know, real for Hegel. It's that more so than something like a absolute flux, which I think he would see as that's just another kind of moment within that whole dynamic of force that he talks about. Even though a lot of what he talks about is process kind of oriented, definitely. But at the same time, he probably, well, I don't think Nietzsche's saying exactly, you know, it's all just like this crazy flux necessarily. I mean, he kind of gets close to it in the sense that he's saying, you know, we don't necessarily understand this, you know, as it is. Although it's not, so this is kind of a side point, but Nietzsche isn't making a kind of Kantian, like dualistic kind of argument, but he is, I think, agreeing with Hegel in this sense, at least, that there's a kind of mode of our understanding that does give these kind of artificial, sort of abstract renderings of reality, what we take to be as true. But then these are kind of modes in which the will is trying to grasp these things. And it's kind of interesting that Hegel talks about, you know, desire, like self-consciousness is desire. That's very interesting and doesn't seem to get much discussion, at least it seems like, in comparison with someone like Nietzsche, where, you know, these are different ideas, but it'd be interesting to hear someone that is more knowledgeable than me talk about something like that. Is, yeah, who knows?
So here's a, you know, I know the section that we just finished was called Consciousness. That was the title of it, Hegel's title. And then this B is self-consciousness. And so I'm afraid that I'm interpreting this too simplistically when I ask questions like this. But so is he in the section on consciousness, is he describing, you know, he calls these, well, at least this translation, shapes of consciousness. In the first section, A, is this literally like the shapes of consciousness prior to or without any real self-consciousness? Because, you know, one of the standard things, I think, at least coming from Kant, is, you know, this notion of apperception, that to be conscious means to be conscious, self-conscious in some way. You know, to say I am, I mean, you know, when you say I know, I am aware, well, there's an I there. I am aware. And so the fact of awareness seems to imply awareness of self. On the other hand, there are these, which I've alluded to before, these there are these states of, let's see, what had Meta called it non-intentional consciousness. I mean, these are actually things that really happen. These are not abstract ideas. There are non-intentional modes of consciousness in which there is not a strong awareness of self. And so what I'm wondering, does this mean that in this section A, he is talking about shapes of consciousness literally prior to, a perception, prior to self-awareness, or am I, interpreting those terms too literally?
Yeah, I think so. So I've been reading this secondary source, The Logic of Desire. It's really good, but in here it says, shapes of consciousness are not psychological phenomena, but claims to know absolutely, stages on the way to science. So once again, there are those ideas of, I posit something to be absolutely certain. That's one shape of consciousness, which is going to be, so consciousness is always going to be this interplay, this relation that's also a kind of disjunction of a subject and an object. That's what it seems like to me, at least. So the shape of that is exactly, okay, how exactly is that playing out in the sense of a kind of knowledge claim? And it's, I'm not sure exactly that it's exactly somebody, saying specifically, like, I know this to be certain and true. It seems like that's possibly the case. I'm not totally sure, but or if it's this kind of implicit thing, but there's always this kind of epistemological corollary involved with this shape of consciousness, it seems like, for Hegel. So
are we
yeah.
jumping the gun a little bit too? Because it seems like what Nevid is asking or talking about is what he ended this chapter on, saying that the next chapter is going to be about. Because that's what I'm wondering, is like, if we're kind of like going from force to how consciousness is aware of itself, because I was under the impression the next part is going to be talking about how consciousness, I can speak, consciousness is almost aware of itself and how it is, or how Hegel defines it in the next chapter.
Well, I think that's true. I'm jumping ahead. What I was just pointing to was the difference in the names of those sections, and asking what that implied about the first section. So the fact that he calls section B self-consciousness, what does that tell us about the first section? That there is something lacking there, some sort of self-consciousness that is lacking in the first section. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think one temptation that I think is probably a bad one is to interpret this as some sort of temporal succession. Like there's this, and then there's this shape, and then this shape, and then this shape. Although I wonder if you might be able to do that in terms of like the development of consciousness from infancy, into adulthood or something. Maybe because from what I understand, which I don't understand well, is that the newborn child does not really have a sense of self, and that the world is kind of chaos. And then through this process of experience, it begins to develop a sense of things in the world, even before it has a sense of self. So it's possible you might be able to make some sort of correlation. But even if you completely ignore that and say it has nothing to do with a temporal succession, it's simply, I don't know what you would describe it, shapes of consciousness in the sense of what's I don't want to use the word conceptual because it's a loaded term, but what sort of almost a transcendental argument, except applied to consciousness. To have a consciousness of this kind, what does that imply that it is founded or built upon? And that this shape of consciousness, or the shape that he's trying to get to, implies that there are these prior shapes, at least if not a temporal succession, in some sort of, I don't know what, things being founded on each other in some way.
I think it's really important to stress that part, Nevin. I think sometimes people fall into the trap of reading Hegel as a what's the term? Psychologism, right? And then reading the progression as a kind of empirical progression or historical progression. And as far as I can, especially in the logic, it's a purely logical progression. But I want to say in the phenomenology, it's also meant to be not a temporal progression, but a logical progression. And my way of making sense of this progression in this first section on consciousness and leading up to self-consciousness is it's like a progression from simplicity to more complex forms. So by way of loose analogy, you need to learn to add numbers together before you learn to multiply numbers together. If we're already multiplying numbers together, we may have forgotten that we had to learn to add before we learn to multiply. But even though we've learned to multiply, we still haven't learned to do differential calculus. Differential calculus doesn't necessarily like historically or temporally come after multiplication, right? It's not a temporal relation. It is a logical relation, but one between simplicity and complexity. The complex forms kind of rely on the simple forms, right? But then the simple forms have limitations, and that's why mathematics is developed. So I think I don't think it's going to be a perfect one-to-one mapping or analogy, but I feel like it's a useful analogy for seeing how his logic unfolds. Again, not psychologism and not empirical history, but logic, right? By necessity. Also, in passing, I'll say just this, transition from from understanding to reason, and then I want, and again, it relates to my reading of the logic that as far as I've gotten, but from what I'm getting from a couple sources is Hegel really loves Heraclitus, but he loves Heraclitus because he took Parmenides very, very seriously. He didn't get to Heraclitus and say, now that I realize that all is flux, man, we can just ignore Parmenides. He says, no, the only way to get to an understanding of flux is by taking Parmenides seriously, right? So I think part of what we're doing, what he's doing is showing that, the understanding tries to grasp a permanent reality and can understand itself as changing because we change, we come across new information, we change our ideas about the things, but the world itself must be, transcendently true in this static way. And then Hegel's like, no, the world is flux. And I think we can, we get to a higher level when we get to self-consciousness, and we can do something close to reason, as opposed to Parmenidean inspired attempt to understand the world in its being, right? Hegel wants to do a Heraclitean grasping of the world in its flux, which you need to get to do Parmenides first. You need to try to understand things in their static being before you can really understand what flux is. Otherwise, it just becomes a meaningless void.
That's why he can't. That's why he has to drag us through this whole book. Why he can't just say, okay, let's jump to the end where we figure out what the stuff is really doing.
Just because no one else is talking. Something I had read, just kind of, and y'all had reminded me of it earlier in our conversation when someone mentioned something about like, is Hegel going to get to the point where he's just like, oh, y'all haven't gotten here yet, but this is just me, and how this kind of relates to in like Calculating the Logic of Desire. He's kind of like saying that like understanding, understanding's like process with this force into law and explanation and this like this inner world that's posited in this inner inverted world. It has like this kind of like its block is its like inability to come to like identify itself as force or like come to see that it's like involved as this negating process in this inner world, that it's like it is the thing that's in the inner world, right? Like kind of how Hunter had said that like you only see something because it itself is looking back there. But it like
Kalkovich was saying that this kind of like shows us the process that we ourselves go through in the book as the kind of like the we, the us, right? Like we can read this and think like, he's not talking about me. He's not talking about me. He's not talking about me. Like Kalkovich will show how like slowly and surely you like begin to pick up that like, oh shit, no, that's me. And you come to like identify with the process going along in the book, how Hegel like frames it, I think in his preface or somewhere, that how like this is his own journey too, right? Like I'm imagining him as like embarking on like trying to prove his own certainty in this book, and just like working through these things himself as he's writing it. And you know, he makes that differentiation between like consciousness and yeah. Oh, actually, yeah. Me and Kalkovich, that's what I keep saying. Yeah, he's the author of that book Chase just put up, Logic of Desire.
Thank you.
Which is, I want to say, like a rather non-scholarly secondary source, which did have me a little skeptical, but it's easy to just like coast through alongside this. But anyways, yeah, so I'm just like, oh, that differentiation between like consciousness and for us and for we. And he's like giving us the credit of being like farther along in the path than consciousness. Where it almost, you know, like I don't know, like it almost feels like a poke at me sometimes, because I'm like, am I really? Like, fuck it, I'm at this, and the sensuous this, like here now, be here now. But I'm just like, it just really made me have this kind of like admiration for this like book. And this kind of like, you know, what Hunter had said, like thinking less so on this just like a conceptual thing. Like, yeah, it's all wordy and shit, but just like Kalkovich does bring in this kind of like aspect to it that's just like, this fucking book is amazing. And it is cool kind of like feeling into that with Hegel and with him of this like experience that the book is itself like provoking, at least me to have, of feeling like, you know, yeah, I'm the we, I'm the us, like that's not me, but coming to see like, oh shit, that's me. And I think moving from consciousness to self-consciousness like is kind of that recognition, where consciousness is the stages, composed of the stages of you know, sense, certainty, perception, and understanding. All those are like as if it's just like receiving certainty from an external object, like it's just kind of like passive. Whereas self-consciousness is kind of coming to realize that like, oh no, it's all me, like it's all and like Kalkovich, or yeah, the author of the secondary source, he makes the note about how like this kind of shift from passive to active, and like Hegel's shapes, they don't just like incrementally advance themselves, but like this dialectic is like jumping between opposites. So it goes from this like this stage of consciousness, and then it jumps to the very opposite of saying like, oh no, the only thing I get certainty from is like myself. And I think this is like what the first stage of self-consciousness is going to be like, where it's not necessarily this just like incremental change from the understanding, but it like jumps to the very opposite of gaining certainty from like a this, like a sensuous this, and it like poses the I as like a sensuous I. So yeah, I just found that really interesting, how it's like we see these almost this similar steps. Like at least it felt like he was about to go through the similar steps that consciousness went through, except on the side of the subject, on the I. And he says it somewhere in the little section, yeah, at the bottom of page 106, when he says the object is the pure I. It'll become enriched and will contain the development that we have seen in life, in the same way that the development of the concept for understanding went from a this to a thing to force. It's like the I itself has to also go through this thing, and then come to recognize that the process it's going through is the process it's already gone through. Maybe not temporally, but at least I've been thinking like logically. And like recognize that like that process that is external to itself is also like its process too. And at least like that's my understanding, the rough like distant understanding I have of like this progression to reason. So consciousness is like seeing this process in the external world. Self-consciousness is like finding it internally, and then reason is like self-consciousness being able to like reconcile its own process with the external world. And at least that's how Kakavaj was posing it, as like self-consciousness is now going to pit itself like against the objective external world, and its development, its enrichment is going to be like coming to terms with the external world as something that's like making it feel uncertain.
What that makes me think of is this dispute between empiricism and rationalism. You know, so you have someone like Hume saying you have to start with sensory experience, and that's where you're going to get truth. And you really don't know if there's any self at all. So kind of ignore that. And then Descartes, on the other hand, saying, actually, what I really know is that I exist as a thinking thing. And what's really questionable is this supposed external world. And your description makes it sound like he starts with one view and then shows that one sort of collapses. And then then he goes back to the other view and then shows that one collapses. You know, when you said he was kind of going from one side to the other. I don't know if he's doing that explicitly, but that's kind of what it makes it sound like. When we're talking about sensuous certainty, it's like the certainty of empirical experience, and then self-certainty. Oh, the only thing I know for sure is that I exist as a thinking thing. But then if you take both of those to the limit, they both kind of, end up refuting themselves.
I think,
And,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. Joey, when you were speaking initially about Kalkovich's sense of Hegel's ideas and how he was presenting them, when you were talking about it seemed like you were saying Hegel was showing us in this text his own mind, kind of like how he was working through different issues. And I never thought I'd say this about Hegel, but it seemed like he was. I mean, the little bit I've read about the life of the Buddha, when you look at presentation of the Buddha, it's like, well, he was an ascetic, and then he rejected asceticism, and then he did. There's this progression to self-enlightenment, and there is a connection for human understanding between the inner and the outer, and it's the progression, and it really hit me that it was Buddha-like. Is that nuts?
I think that's a great point. I mean, yeah. Just like Buddha had to be an ascetic and then rejected, otherwise he wouldn't have been who he was, right? Yeah. I like the way Nevid pointed it out, how on the one hand we start with kind of an empiricism, and then on the other, and then we kind of take the sojourn into like the rationalism, and we find that they're both inadequate. Every time I'm reading Hegel, I keep thinking that he's writing to his contemporaries who are still very much enamored by Fichte, right? And Kant's new philosophy, new critical philosophy, is still a relatively new thing on the scene, which most people in the time are very admiring of. Most, not all, but nobody's admiring of without qualification, right? But what Kant did is essentially do what Hegel's just done in this chapter or in this section, right? Like, well, concepts and what is it? Intuitions and concepts, right? Intuitions without concepts are blind, and concepts without intuitions are empty. You need concepts and intuitions in order to come to understanding, right? And so, but this we only got Kant because we had a tradition of empiricists who put forward a bunch of arguments in dialogue with a tradition of rationalists who put forward a bunch of arguments. And Kant sees the one-sided truth of each and is able to come to a higher understanding of the truth that accommodates both some of the intuitions of the empiricists and then some of the intuitions of the rationalists without either being an empiricist or a rationalist, right? So I don't know, I feel like that's a really important kind of thing to bring into view. And then also Fichte, and I've never read Fichte. I looked up the Wissenschaftslehre once as a book to buy, and it was like $88, and I was just not prepared to shell out $88 for a solo study of Wissenschaftslehre. So all I have access to are secondary sources. But I think Fichte looms large in the background here. I'll just just make my point. First, Kant's transcendental transcendental unity of a perception, right, is a necessary consequence of any judgment, right? And that that is that you recognize yourself as the same self through experiences, right? Fichte didn't quite like the formulation of the transcendental unity of a perception, and kind of posited a different idea of thinking about what this is, and he thought of this self consciousness that extends through all experiences as necessary a self I positing the I at the same time it pauses a not I. In order to make sense of an I, you have to make sense of the not I. So in order to see a self through a stable, persisting self through experiences, we have to at one and the same time posit the I and then posit the not I, right? And I think this is one of the things that really drives Fichte's philosophy, but also deeply informs Hegel's, right? Hegel likes that. As far as I can see, Hegel likes that insight, but he doesn't like what Fichte did with it, right? I think he wants to take that insight and bring it back into a Kantian, more closer to the Kantian framework, which leads me to the point I was going to try to make, I guess, from the beginning, from what Nevitt was pointing out, right? That like Kant was straddling the empiricist and the rationalist. Hegel is very much faithful to Kant in this regard. I think there's been a controversy about how to read Hegel. Many people have charged Hegel with falling back behind the critical philosophy. Hegel sees himself as pursuing Kant's critical philosophy, his Copernican turn, all the way through its logical conclusion. But people who have misread Hegel think, or maybe read Hegel against his intentions, right? Think that what Hegel did was ignore Kant's restriction of knowledge of things beyond our experience, and just that didn't work, right? Kant made some mistakes. That all falls down. We can just ignore that and proceed as if Kant never existed, which I think is very far from the truth. I think Hegel very much takes Kant's spirit deeply, but pushes through his system to see where it kind of unends itself, undermines itself, right? So the thing in itself, sorry, I know I'm talking for a bit. I'm talking, take this too long, but I recently read an article that argues that Kant never intended the thing in itself as a metaphysical ontological postulate. It is simply a category to be used by the understanding for, as a posit of that thing that we can't know, like you can't possibly know anything apart from your relationship to it. So it's more of a beyond an epistemological limit than it is a ontological posit of things that are as they are. And I think a lot of us were taught to read Kant as positing this thing in itself as this mysterious entity. And from what I've read recently, there's a lot of grounds to think that's not what he's doing at all. It's just a category that he uses to describe things that are beyond our ken, necessarily beyond our ken. I think from that reading, Hegel agrees, right? As far as that is concerned.
Just to, this is just a thought I had, super brief, but it's just, yeah, I think there's a lot of, there are a lot of Hegelians that talk about like, there's like, and this is at least like one, like a kernel of like of hope for me, I guess, that we're not totally misguided when we say that Hegel is not pre-Kantian. I just see a lot of Hegelians say like, okay, there have been some theories about reverting back to like a pre-Kantian realism. Let's talk about like, there's, what if we kind of just engaged in like a pre-Kantian realism, like a pre-critical sort of thing. But the argument that I've usually heard is that the problem with Kant is that, and I don't know if this is necessarily in line with positing the in itself as a metaphysical postulate, like as this sort of entity, but the critique that I've kind of heard mounted amongst Hegelians, at least Alenka Zupančič, who actually I was going to mention, if anybody here is interested in where Nietzsche and Hegel come together, Alenka Zupančič is a scholar of both. And she's just a big fan of Nietzsche and Hegel. And she wrote a book called What is Sex? That I've heard is very, very good. And I've read little bits and pieces of it. But she makes an argument, and this is just stuff that I've heard in my Discord reading group for Sex and the Failed Absolute. There's some people in there that are big fans of Alenka Zupančič. But the idea that I've heard is that Kant attempted to kind of bring metaphysics to a greater height than was theoretically possible at the time within the formal framework that was established by Hume. Hume had kind of laid the ground, he had sort of set the bar. Hume, in a way, set the bar for a lot of Western thought. And that bar was to say, metaphysics is just postulating about the ether. Like there needs to be a concentration on the real and on, and like a total admittance of the reality of the guillotine of is and ought. You know what I mean? Like Hume really kind of set the stage. And it was him and Spinoza who was like on the other side saying that that God is infinite and therefore is everything and therefore the world is God, you know, and going on this sort of more directly metaphysical spin, but in this totally different direction of like absolute, like everything is God thing. But Kant came after that, and he not only tried to kind of bring metaphysics into a new space by trying to go against or try to overcome the problems that were presented by Hume. I'm hesitant to say overcome, but to take seriously and to question and critique and to try to advance the positive value that's present in the problems that were raised by Hume. That's how I'll say that. And in that sense, like Kant's, but at the same time, he's going against Spinoza by positing the split, the crack in the absolute of God is everything. He says, well, God is everything, yes, but I can't know everything about everything. You know what I mean? Or in fact, I can't know everything about anything. So my reason is always partial and cut off and broken. And there's this gap between me and the world. And in that sense, he reifies human limitation. He's like making more real, like, yeah, humans are limited creatures with limited perceptions and cannot, or limited understandings and reasoning capacities, and can't totally access the thing in itself. And so the thing that he sets out to oppose is empiricism, which sees metaphysics as speculation. But for Kant and his metaphysics, reason will forever kind of want what it can't have. And so reason ultimately renounces itself, where in like a point where the most reasonable thing to do becomes like denying reason altogether, or waiving the act of reasoning altogether, at least at a certain point in reason. The most reasonable thing to do becomes kind of like recognizing the ultimate impasse in the limitation of reason. And in that sense, critical philosophy reopens a space for pragmatism. You know what I mean? Like, and that's why I think a lot of American pragmatists take Kant very, very, very seriously. Like William James was super like interested in what Kant was doing, and Peirce and stuff like that. But I guess my take on or my understanding, I have two things I guess to say about that. First, I think that Hegel has kind of a different perspective, and I could explain this more if it's necessary, but whatever. I think that Hegel would say like it's not necessarily that like we are these limited shitty creatures, pardon my French, but these stupid limited creatures that are interacting with this perfect complete world that we just failed to grasp. He says we do fail to grasp it, yes, but if we actually investigate kind of what's happening when we interact with the thing, at least what has been playing out here in the text so far, it seems to me like Hegel is saying like the things are blurry and incomplete. The world is incomplete and transient and constantly vanishing. The extremes are vanishing, and the middle is vanishing, and these things are just kind of falling apart. But we, in our perception, we complete the things. We perform the act of, and this is all in like scare quotes, I guess. It'd be like, we complete the things. It's our engagement with it that completes it, that gives it essence, that is the void behind it, that raises the questions, that opens the space for fantasies. But just back to my original point, yeah, Alenka is associated with Zizek. She's one of like the big three, Dolar, Zupanchik, and Zizek. But anyway, I think that Hegel, I read this thing about Hegel and the French Revolution. I had to do some reading for a paper. I had this art theory class that was just the worst thing ever. I had a terrible, terrible, terrible art theory class because I thought it'd be like, oh, problems in art theory. Oh, that sounds so interesting. Let's get into it. Like, what is beauty or whatever? But no, it was the title of the class was art theory. And the content of the class was like, here's how to be an art teacher. And I was like, oh, God, you had to come up with lesson plans and all this bull hockey. And I was not having it. And I had this stupid assignment where I had to write about cultural appropriation. And I decided I was like, okay, I'm going to make this as dense and difficult to grade as possible. I'm going to just use as many jargon-filled syllogisms and buzzwords as physically possible. And so I was like, okay, let's talk about Hegel and Haiti. Let's talk about that. Like, if we want to talk about culturally, like cultures moving. Oh, and I was like, instead of anything in the class, I was like, and I had to do some reading of Hegel and the French Revolution. What I read is that his general perspective on the French Revolution is that it was a horrible failure. It was like, it was this moment of like libertine fraternity and democracy as a form, at least, at the very least, as a consistent, at least as a minimally consistent formality at the beginning of the French Revolution. It was this mission of liberty and fraternity and whatever, right? And then it fell into like the Jacobin thing, like the Jacobin terror and the rise of Napoleon, which he was like, I mean, there are the places where he says that Napoleon was the world soul, yes. But there's a lot of stuff that he's also written that does not imply any sort of special or particular allegiance to Napoleon. You know, I mean, you can recognize that a guy is a world soul without necessarily thinking that he's a great guy. But Hegel's general perspective on the French Revolution is that there's something present within all things, all endeavors, including the French Revolution and including Kant. This is the connection. I want to compare Kant to the French Revolution here, that while it may fall to pragmatism, or it may reopen the space for empiricism, which is the thing that it set out to destroy, or if it falls to Jacobin terror, or Napoleon becomes the emperor and ransacks communities and livelihoods for decades as a result of this tragedy, there is some part of what happened that is worthy of saving, or of carrying the torch of. Read Kant not by the letter necessarily, but by the spirit. Like, don't take his word as the final word, but go into philosophy and approach him as a young Kant would have. If a young Kant was reading Kant, would he have been so immediately like, yeah, this is great, I'm done? Or would he have been like, you know, this is good, but there might be some more with the spirit of a Kantian like attitude of investigation into what's already there, with the spirit that was the torch that can still be carried on past the French Revolution. There's a part of the emancipatory project, or of the project in general, that is worth saving, you know. And I think that's like why Hegel is in this weird like very, very directly opposing Kant sort of stance, but also like, it's kind of like Obi-Wan and Anakin. It's like he desperately wants to save him. It's like, he's like, you were my brother. You were supposed to save metaphysics, not destroy it. And, you know, and Kant is there like, I hate you. And you're trying to destroy my system, my categories. And Hegel's like, you're lost. I don't know. You are lost. And He's trying to continue on in the spirit of what was there, which was a very good friend, you know, which is a stupid reference. But I also, actually, I thought about Star Wars earlier today when he said the Force. When I was reading, or yesterday when I was reading and he said the Force, I couldn't help but think of Star Wars, but whatever. Okay, that's it.
So we haven't talked much about force, and I'm so confused by that whole section that I'm not even sure what question to ask. But I mean, it's clear, you know, because he's talking about electrons and gravity, that he means his discussion of force to be deeply related to what we conceive as physical forces. But I just do not understand what he's doing in that section and how he gets these ideas of what we perceive as physical forces from this dialectical something or other. I don't know, it's a huge broad question, but does anyone have any help there?
Oh God, I hate talking and then immediately talking again right after somebody else talks. I feel like a freaking jerk. But in fact, speak now. Forever hold your peace.
Wow.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, that's pretty.
Nevik, could you ask your question again? I thought I understood it and then it went over me.
So, you know, a big chunk of the text that we had to read for this time is about force. And, you know, at first he talks about force in a very abstract way as it emerges from some sort of dialectical process that I don't understand. And by the time he's done talking with it, he's saying, and this is exactly how you end up with physical forces, you know, dialectical physical forces, like literally positive and negative electricity and gravity and stuff like that. So I just didn't really understand how he ended up, you know, what does force mean for Hegel in a really broad sense? And then how does he end up, you know, how is it that he shows that this is actually what manifests as physical forces? I didn't understand.
You know, when you asked the question a second time, I remember the famous, or now it becomes a cliche from Victor Hugo. Nothing is so powerful as an idea whose time has come. And when you ask the capital F force in a Hegelian sense, and bringing up both the ideational and the physical, reminded me of Hugo's quote. I think it's Hugo, isn't it? Yeah. So because, you know, what people can be making the same arguments for decades and nothing seems to move, right? The dominant doesn't move. And then there seems to be a sometimes short period of time, relatively short period of time. We can use astrological terms, you know, all the stars align, but then it just seems like, yeah, everybody says, yes, we need to do this. And it isn't anything that people hadn't already been talking about. And yet somehow there's a constellation of little f forces that seem to mesh perfectly. So I'm answering this in a barefoot kind of way, but it's, to me, he was using both elements of the idea of force.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a lot of, well, I mean, like, I think that's a big part of his, like the double reading thing, like that is possible in a lot of his like deployment of terms. But I think that, like, when it came to force, like, I think that he's doing both. Like, he's talking about like the physical sort of forces and like force as a concept. Like, it's like he's giving each its turn. He's like, well, forces must just be totally a concept. But wait a second, turns out that if we think of it as just a concept, well, what is a concept but an amalgamation of physical whatever? Like he's constantly so. Okay, I'm not gonna get into, because I could just talk about like but I don't want to get into what I think he does with this idea. I mean, I think it's cool, but I just want to talk about where I think force comes from. So he talks about these unconditional universals in perception or in the understanding, or in just perception at that point. So the unconditional universal is the object for perception. And being only here as an object for perception, this unconditional universal, being only present here as an object for perception, the like being for itself and the being for another of the absolute contact of the absolute contact of being for itself and being for another in an object is the unconditional universal. Let me just establish that first. The unconditional universal that he's talking about is that being for itself and being for another are unified in a single self-sufficient entity, where unity and self-sufficiency are being unified self-sufficiently. Isn't that crazy? So he's like, and perception is just like, that's cool. That's fine. That's good. I'm fine. I'm done with that. That's all I need. But he's saying, so this unconditional universal is an object for the perception, and being only here as a object of perception, the two, the being for itself and the being for another, have to interact, and they don't diverge. They don't split off, and do their own things in themselves, because they're both objects for perception. They don't diverge, but they self-sublate and transition into another because they share this space, and they're kind of melting and oohing and gooing into each other, like this Mobius strip sort of movement that he gets into later, of vanishing at the extremes and only being in the middle, a place that Lacan calls the quilting point, but whatever. So this self-sublating and this transitioning into another, it leaves of this self-sublating and transitioning into another, of being for itself and being for another, it gives rise, or gives us kind of access to see the universality of a multiplicity. He says this directly: a universality of a multiplicity of distinct universals. And this is part of his point of a self-sufficiency and a unity unified self-sufficiently. It's a universality of a multiplicity of distinct universalities. It's just this, basically, I get to try and make that, I guess, make more sense. It's these two categories of being for itself and being for another that are totally distinct, but their distinctness puts them into a multiplicity that is connected by some sort of universality of being in a multiplicity, or being drawn to each other. That universality that he's talking about is universal internal antagonism, I think, or the draw, the being together, the universality. I mean, this is kind of a spoiler for later on in the section, but the universality is the being there in consciousness, like in the understanding, in the universal medium. But okay, so the point is, they reciprocally permeate each other, but, and this is kind of his reversal, they don't or can't touch. He says that they can't directly touch or make contact. And his reasoning is that distinct universals, if we take being for itself and being for another as distinct universals, they are each self-sufficient. They are each totally self-sufficient. And if we're going to posit them as self-sufficient, then we can't posit a necessary touching. We can't posit any necessary touching. With this POS, let me tell you, I'm done with this POS. We can't posit a necessary touching because they're supposed to be self-sufficient. But the difference itself, remix, the difference itself between the being for another and being for itself is itself self-sufficient. And so it's a self-sufficient connection That self-sufficient connection is a universal medium, the universal medium of self-sufficient difference that connects things. And difference, in this sense, if we could just look at this kind of thing we're doing, this train that we've been on, difference passes over to unity, which passes over to this unfolding, which then passes over to reduction, etc. Ad nauseum. But this passing between these things of like, oh, but they reciprocally permeate each other. But wait, they can't touch because they're self-sufficient. Oh, but the self-sufficiency is what makes them different. Yeah, well, that difference of self-sufficiency is itself self-sufficient. And that, but wait a second, that self-sufficient difference is itself a universal medium. How can it be a universal medium while being totally self-sufficient? Well, but and difference is passing to unity, and then to this unfolding, and then reduction, and then it passing it back into like a difference, and then into, this process, this passing. That's force. This passing is called force. That's my understanding of what he means when he says force. Now, what he does with that force, I think that he would argue that like the understanding sees that force, and that force becomes law as the understanding kind of chews on it. But yeah.
Would you say that again? What becomes force? The passing, what passing?
The passing from an unconditional universal. We start with an unconditional universal that subjectivity, that perception, that a reflective mode of being, a perception or a consciousness, it accepts an unconditional universal. And in accepting that unconditional universal, if it investigates it, it'll find all this fucked up shit about it, like that this unconditional universal is only present for it. And so the unconditional universal connection of being for itself and being for another means that they can't diverge, but they have to self-sublate and transition into each other. And they reciprocally permeate each other. But that also means that they can't touch each other because distinct universals are definitionally self-sufficient. But that also means, you see, the point, I'm not going to go through it again, but the point is that it's a series of like these logically necessary implications of what we're saying, and these logically necessary implications of like difference and like difference as a self-sufficiency, as a universal medium, as this unity, as this unfolding, or as this like reduction. It's force. It's the force. It's, if you want to think about it like Star Wars, it's like it's the force. The force is the thing that's moving the train along. It's like karma.
Can I ask a question really quick? I'm sorry, Nevit. Go. Okay, so this is where I got confused when I was reading him, because it's almost like he was referring to the force as this complete totality of movement within the totality of movement. Like there was two ways, but he almost used it interchangeably. And that's where I was getting a little confused. Like there's the force that is the totality of everything, and then there's the force that operates within the force of the totality of everything. And I think, is that kind of what you're saying?
I just wanted to give Chase space if he wanted to say anything on that. But honestly, I just think that he treats force in a million different ways in this chapter for me. It seems like to me, it's like he's like, okay, force is this passing. Is okay, if we accept it as this passing, it's like he's like tripping out. He's just going crazy in this like direction. He's just like digging to an obsessive degree in this direction. And as he's doing it, he's saying, okay, force is this passing, and this passing, yes, is like this universal medium, this this unconditional universal that's driven back into itself and stands opposed to unfolding, but like he says, okay, so like force is the whole, and therefore these differences between force and unfolding and all this must be purely formal, but the force in itself is distinct, and so both are truly because both are truly self-sufficient. he's making this point that like when we say the whole, like force as the whole, it's I think force is the dynamic power that is generated by this continuous dialectical process. Yes, I think that force is like the name for the dynamic power, I suppose, that is the dialectical movement of terms and concepts in the presence of like a reflection, in the presence of like a reflective capacity. But I don't know if that's necessarily true. I will take my lashings if it's not. But my point is, like force, he uses it in the, like Joseph, just in response to your question, it's like force, he describes it as like both. At one point, he's like, okay, well, well, all of our logic up to this point has said that force is a universal, right? Okay, well then, if we take it seriously and we take all the prior implications, we have to recognize that it's actually not just a universal, or not just the whole or the universal, but is distinct and self-sufficient necessarily. What does that mean? And so it seems like he's talking about two different forces, but I think he's just talking about the different shapes of force as it's kind of moving through this. And I hesitate to say moving, but yeah, kind of. It's like moving. Yeah. And also, Nevitt, in response to your thing in the text, I think that sounds right. But like there's an alarm bell in my brain that's telling me that like I'm being too simplistic or something as I say that. But I'm very much inclined to say that, yeah, what you're thinking sounds right. But I just feel like, I don't know, some ghost is haunting me right now. Somebody's yelling at me through the ether that I'm wrong. I can feel it.
Yes,
Maybe
I
it's
think,
Hegel.
yeah, I think consciousness is involved in all this stuff. But okay, so I'm just gonna give a very simplistic, oversimplified explanation of it the best I can, in hopes that if anything, at least if I'm wrong, maybe someone can correct me. But okay, well, why do we have, what's up with force? It's okay. So it seems like what is going on is that consciousness or spirit or whatever is trying to preserve and kind of hold on to some kind of truth claim, some kind of absolute truth claim. But then it runs into these contradictions, which then in the effort to keep going and try to preserve those truth claims to a certain extent, it leads towards others. So I think I read this in the Logic of Desire, or it was made more explicit that way, is that, okay, perception was a way of trying to hold on to the particularity of sense certainty by grounding it in this more stable, more determined mode of understanding that was the thing of perception. And okay, you've got the thing of perception and you've got all of its qualities, but then the problems arise when relations get involved, especially with the qualities themselves or with other things. And I think force is a way to kind of try to resolve those difficulties, but essentially to keep holding on to the truth claim of things, but by instead of putting their truth claim kind of one degree further back, in a sense, where now you've got, instead, okay, yeah, you've got this naive concept of just things that are, have qualities, that color and texture or whatever, but you see that, okay, how do those come about? Clearly there's some kind of a process, some kind of physical process going on. There's energy exchanges. There's something active that's more unified than just these, random kind of qualities that are like stuck together in the object. Okay, how do we explain those? How do they coordinate with each other and relate to each other? And how is there movement within all these things? I think force is a way to try to explain that by giving a new kind of universal that is, okay, well, it's the force, you know? I don't think he ever says the force, but I like that.
He
So
does.
I think we'll go with that. Yeah. Okay. Confirmed. All right. So it says, okay, I'm going to both simplify it to a certain degree, but then in order to save it by saying that, okay, we've got now this, okay, first it's a kind of abstract concept of force, say, oh, something stupid, I don't know. Hegel doesn't say this, but so like the force of love or something like that. I think Empedocles said that or something, but anyways, so then I've got this idea of force. So, okay, that's this active driving thing that moves the perceptual object and coordinates all the ways it works that don't make sense in terms of just the logic imminent to the perceptual thing and its qualities itself. So instead you got this force, but then like, okay, where the hell is this force? You know, oh, well, see, we just see, you know, the phenomena, the appearances, but force is really, you have to look within. You have to look within to find force, you know, and then you get this other movement into, okay, now there's kind of this other world that kind of mirrors our own to a certain degree, that tries to explain the flux and the activity and the relational aspect that grounds the perceptual thing and which grounds some kind of particular certainty in this, the external sensory world, something like that. So then you've got this almost a kind of platonic sort of ignoring all the intricacies of you know, Kantian interpretation, but you know, some kind of like a noumenal world in this kind of naive sense, where okay, now I've got, or even some kind of a transcendental kind of thing where okay, there's some kind of there must be something outside of appearance, outside of these things or whatnot, that is actually coordinating them and that makes them possible. These are their conditions of possibility for this experience. Rough.
Sorry, that's my dog.
It's all good. So yeah, then you got this new kind of movement within force, but okay, then there's the law thing. So okay, I think I sort of went out of order, if there is a order kind of, but so I think it was supposed to be law and then explanation, but the way I'm reproducing it here, I guess it's kind of reversed, but that's kind of Hegelian, right? So then you get a law. So I could say, okay, oh, you know, there's not just this vague force of love or the force or whatever, you know, that was just copied from Taoism, and George Lucas just read Joseph Campbell and just like copied it, like almost word for word or whatnot, you know. So basically, that none of that. You know, let's sublate, you know, Star Wars and the Force, and let's get really determined. Let's get really specific. You know, I want some hard answers here. I need some calculations. So I'm going to find the regularities that that go along with what I see in appearances that explain the perceptual thing, that give me certainty. Therefore, I know. You know, as long as I can calculate these things in this regular way, then I know. But then you see that there's a whole bunch of problems that arise from the law aspect that, well, I don't feel like going into, to be honest, because yeah, it's complicated. But that's my, yes, it's complicated. This book is complicated. Did you guys notice that? Yeah. So that's my elementary attempt to explain force. That's, yeah. Did that help at all?
So here's a question. I know we're out of time, but since we may not return to this again. So based on what Hunter and Chase said and Joey's question, because what I was going to ask before Joey's question is that, is force just sort of an artifact of the understanding? But then after Joey's question, what I'm wondering is force, again, maybe this is the wrong way to put it, but is force the sort of power of this dialectical movement in relation to consciousness? And then is it then that the understanding, in order to grasp that, starts breaking it down into these polarities? Is that what's going on here? Or is force itself somehow a manifestation of the interaction between the understanding and its object? So you see the difference? In other words, is force something that's essential in the dialectical process itself, and then understanding gets it wrong, or kind of loses the detail when it posits these hard polarities? Or is force itself only a manifestation of the way the understanding processes these things? If you can't see what the question is, that's fine. We'll just stop here.
So, okay.
I was kind of guessing, but I just put a comment saying that I thought it was the first, and that the understanding positing force is basically the understanding kind of projecting this feature of the dialectic into an external other. And then like when it kind of comes to itself as a universal unconditioned, which I feel like I don't really know what I'm saying there, but I just know like that's the transition into law. So I think it again, like just kind of has like a further projection of another realm as this like inner of things, which is like making things move. And I think like ultimately, like at least what I got out of this last understanding section was that the transition to self-consciousness means like our shape of consciousness that we're following finally like recognizes and kind of like takes force into itself and sees this like dynamic power, as you put it earlier, as like coming from itself.
Okay, that's helpful. And all of you guys seem to be on the same page from the comments. So that helps me think through that. I had some other snarky comment to make, but now I can't remember what it was. I don't know.
Yeah. So I think Joey, you basically answered that question for me. But yeah, I think he's definitely saying that it's a kind of projection of the self. Although I think it still has some kind of, reality as an effect, I guess, as this kind of the positive, the active component of, the negativity of something. That you possibly see it something like that, where, okay, I have some kind of wrong conception of something, or I project something. I think that still kind of creates determinations that are still important, but I don't think force is something that works, within the dialectic or whatnot. I think that's more reason in the concept, which the concept is something that kind of it's unfolding is the dialectic, it seems like, where force is just a moment within that does get preserved when it's sublated into self-consciousness or whatnot. But yeah, for the most part, I think you can definitely see it as a kind of, in the kind of the psychological way, well, not psychologism, but just it's a helpful way of thinking as a kind of projection, I guess. I mean, he says that in his kind of like Hegelese, really silly way of doing it, of like infinite, negativity, absolute, determinate. Yeah, Actually, I've caught myself speaking in Hegelian to myself, like thinking in Hegelian. It's really scary, but yeah.
Is it safe to say that it's almost a way to find in a universal medium variances or differences while they're also the same, if that makes sense? Like the force allows that to happen from a perception, or I'm sorry, an understanding standpoint?
Yeah, I think so. I think that is part of it. Especially, okay, well, I mainly thought of the part where he talks about law as so they're kind of distinctions, they're determinations that kind of tell you, okay, these are differences, you know, positive, negative, uh, you know, time, space, something like that. But then there's some kind of homogeneity kind of involved there so that they're the same difference. And then there's also this component where, you know, he plays off this differentiation between things, especially the he talks about that with electricity, the positive, negative versus the fact that it's, you know, a single force that's a some kind of yeah, single force. And the thing is though that those differences in the force, positive, negative, aren't actually internally kind of related or differentiated. It doesn't seem to have any kind of logical necessity about why they are that way. But then I think more, I think your question was more kind of about the fact that the differences that are posited, I'm using the word positive a lot. Oh God.
Yeah, because I was reading the section where it says like through the notion of inner difference, these unlike in different moments, space, time, etc., are different, which is no difference, or only a difference of what is self-same and in its essence is unity. So it's almost like he's saying that somehow the universalism of differences and a universal being for itself is somehow done in his concept of force, which is what I'm trying to get.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that makes sense in terms of what I was saying before.
I'm sorry
That,
for going
okay,
over.
yeah, you've got you know, positive, negative electricity, but still it's a difference that isn't really a difference in the sense it's the same thing. What is that same thing? It's simply the single force of electricity. So that's why they're not absolute differences, I think is basically what he's saying there. They're these sort of arbitrary differences, positive, negative, but really it's one thing, it's electricity. I think that's what Hegel's saying.
I was going to point out when I was well, two related intersecting thoughts. As I was reading, you know, this section that we're discussing today, I think it was the 148, the paragraph numbered 148, starting on page 8. Starts on 88 and finishes on 89. I'm not going to read it out loud, but it makes heavy use of difference, right, as a productive concept. And I was, all right, so I was going to point this out. I think it was last week. Chase and Sean both commented on how difficult Hegel is to read, which we all get it, right? But I thought it was curious that Chase and Sean, two guys that like to tout Deleuze and Guattari, were commenting on Hegel being hard to read. Like, if you've ever tried to read Anti-Oedipus, the Phenomenology of Spirit is a breeze by comparison. But anyway, this
I disagree with that. I'm just going to say that I disagree with that.
It's
Yeah.
all over the place. It's all over the place. Anyway, we'll have that argument another time.
Yeah.
But this section, he makes heavy use of difference in a way that I feel like Deleuze would appreciate.
Yeah, that's a complicated one, which I think we're 15 minutes over times, but I think we definitely will have to eventually have that conversation because I think it's pretty interesting to try to think of how Hegel and Deleuze could, you know, interact with that. Of course, Deleuze says that it's not real difference. It always kind of comes back to identity in the end, and to the self and whatnot. But
Hegel's notion of difference is not real difference.
that's what Deleuze says. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. No, I can understand that. I can follow that. I think that's one of Adorno's criticisms too.
Mm.
And Hunter's not here for that part.
Oh, I just realized Hunter left. Yeah.
Just to make things go on longer, I wish Hunter was here to hear this. In semiconductors, you have this lattice of atoms, and the way semiconductors work, and it has to be a semiconductor, it doesn't work for other kinds of materials, but when you have the absence of an electron in the crystal lattice, absence of an electron, it functions electrically like a positive charge. And so you have this weird effect where it's the actual absence of an electron that functions as a positive charge, which sounds very Hegelian to me. Anyway, and I also wonder, sometimes I've wondered if the reason that we keep finding particles is because we're looking for particles. And, the understanding, we think in terms of things. And so you have to understand, maybe we have to understand the way the world works in terms of things, like particles. And so maybe one reason we keep finding fundamental particles is because we have to find particles. That's the only way we can understand things. So anyway, some weird Hegelian reflections. Okay, well, people are leaving. Thank you guys, that was helpful. Bye-bye.